The tension in the executive conference room felt thick enough to fingerprint. 12 senior leaders, one long glass table, quarterly numbers glowing on the screen behind me. No one was talking about revenue anymore. Victor Hale, Chief Executive Officer of Hale Dynamics, sat at the head of the table in a tailored charcoal suit, silver threading his temples. Jaw set like this was a courtroom and I was the defendant. He didn't lower his voice. "Trainer, or clean out your desk." The words landed hard. 9:03 a.m. No one looked at me. They looked at their tablets, their coffee, the skyline, outside those glass walls. The cold wind is still blowing. And where you are listening, what's the temperature right now? And if you're still here with me right now, please leave your lucky number in the comments. Sometimes numbers have their own way of telling stories. I was the Registered System Custodian of a $2.8 billion data platform, the infrastructure responsible for 74% of this company's revenue flow. 17 years building it from bare architecture. 6 independent SEC audits passed without material weakness. 0 catastrophic failures. My signature wasn't symbolic. It was filed in our governance documents. Across from me sat Brittany Hale, 24 marketing degree, requesting full administrative privileges so she could learn faster. The policy drafted after a prior nepotism scandal and unanimously approved by the board states clearly, no executive relative may receive privileged system control without independent audit clearance. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture. I can't authorize that. Victor leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're being uncooperative." Security was called as if citing governance were insubordination. I handed over my badge. No protest. Shock compresses quickly when you understand how systems work better than personalities. They believed that was the end of it. At 9:11 a.m., 8 minutes after my termination notice went out, the executive dashboard refreshed, compliance review, custodian status unverified. Victor had overlooked one technicality: removing a registered custodian required formal board approval. Before we go any further, I want to make this clear. Some details in the story you're about to hear are dramatized and aided by artificial intelligence for storytelling and educational purposes. This story isn't about any specific individual or company, but about patterns, choices, and consequences that many of us have witnessed. I hope you'll stay with me, and if this isn't the kind of story you'd like, that's okay too. Turn off your screens, take a break, and take good care of yourself. By noon, the emergency meeting Victor called felt less like leadership and more like damage control. Brittany was sitting in my chair, my laptop open in front of her, as if proximity alone could grant authority. She didn't look at anyone when she spoke. "Just give me access." The system responded before anyone else could. Access denied. An audit flag flashed red across the dashboard. Victor's jaw tightened. "Override it." IT didn't hesitate. "We can't. Custodian signature required." The room shifted, irritation turning into visible strain. I watched remotely through the same monitoring feed I had configured years ago. 17 years of infrastructure, reduced to a family favor. I remembered the week we almost lost everything 92 hours without sleep, while I sealed a breach that could have cost us $40 million. I remembered drafting the anti-nepotism policy after the scandal 6 years ago. The board had signed it unanimously. Victor himself had said, "Good safeguard." Now he acted like safeguards were optional. Minutes later, an internal email went out declaring my termination for insubordination. The word hung heavier than the accusation. I hadn't refused work. I had enforced policy. What Victor either forgot or chose to ignore was written plainly in our corporate charter. Removal of a registered system custodian required a formal board resolution. When General Counsel finally opened the governance binder, the irritation in the room turned brittle. She looked up slowly. "Victor, we never voted." By 11:30 a.m., the board convened an emergency session, and the tone had shifted from irritation to containment. I wasn't in the room, but I knew the cadence of those meetings, the clipped questions, the legal pads sliding across polished wood, the quiet recalculations. What had started as a personnel issue was now a governance exposure. The company's directors and officers' insurance carrier had already flagged the status change if a registered system custodian was removed outside proper procedure. Compliance coverage could be suspended pending review. Not because of me, because of process. Governance is rarely emotional, it is structural, and structures fail when protocols are ignored. Victor tried to reframe it. She's just an employee. That word just always reveals more than it intends. General Counsel didn't blink. She's a registered governance officer. Her role is filed in our corporate charter. Silence followed. My designation wasn't symbolic. When the board approved the compliance architecture 7 years ago, they embedded my custodial authority into the oversight framework precisely to prevent executive overreach. The system wasn't reacting to loyalty. It was reacting to documentation. If the Securities and Exchange Commission determined that a governance officer had been terminated without board authorization, the consequences were measurable. Potential civil penalties could reach $45 million. Credit rating agencies could downgrade us for internal control instability. Lenders would reassess risk. The exposure wasn't theoretical, it was procedural math. Victor insisted this was overblown. We can fix it internally. But governance violations don't shrink when ignored. They expand under scrutiny. The compliance dashboard status change had already triggered an automated notification under our audit integration agreement. That was the detail no one in the room had anticipated. When the custodian status shifted, the external audit firm received an alert in real time. I didn't have to escalate anything. The system had already done it. The system didn't crash. That would have been dramatic. Almost convenient. Instead, it did something far more unsettling. It tightened. From my home office, I logged into the compliance mirror, read-only access I was still legally entitled to until the board resolved my status. The platform was stable. Transactions were flowing. Data pipelines were intact. But 3 automatic restrictions had activated the moment my custodian status flipped. No new contracts. No executive-level overrides. No financial approvals above $5 million. Not sabotage. Safeguards. By early afternoon, Victor's voice was echoing through another emergency call. "Fix it," he demanded. "Aight," answered carefully. "It's not broken. There's a particular kind of anger that surfaces when power stops working the way it used to." I could almost picture him pacing at the head of the table, cufflinks flashing again under fluorescent lights. He wasn't fighting code. He was fighting structure. At 2:14 p.m., the external audit firm sent a formal email to the board and executive team. Custodian removal flagged. Please provide board minutes authorizing termination. Board minutes. There weren't any. You can override a person. You cannot override documentation that doesn't exist. I didn't need to speak publicly. I didn't need to threaten litigation. The process itself was escalating. The General Counsel knew it. The CFO definitely knew it. Every hour without board authorization increased exposure. Then the secondary consequence hit. Somewhere between the audit notification and the insurance inquiry, word leaked. Maybe from compliance, maybe from legal. Internal instability is catnip for analysts. By market close, our stock had dropped 6%. 6% in a single trading day over what began as a nepotism demand. No servers were down. No clients lost access. Nothing visibly broken. But governance risk is its own headline. Victor wanted the system fixed. The system was functioning exactly as designed. By the next morning, the tone had shifted from irritation to liability. The directors and officers' insurance carrier sent a formal inquiry to the board. Their language was clinical, almost polite. They requested clarification regarding the removal of a registered system custodian without documented board authorization. They wanted to know whether established governance procedures had been followed. That request carried weight. If Victor had terminated me outside the charter's requirements, coverage could be limited or suspended, and if the insurer determined that fiduciary duties had been breached, personal liability would attach. Not corporate, personal. Victor's confidence began to thin. On the internal call, He tried to redirect the narrative. She engineered this. He said, she set the system to retaliate. I almost admired the instinct. When structure exposes you, blame the architect. But the IT logs didn't support him. The compliance restrictions were automatic responses embedded in the governance framework approved by the board years earlier. There was no hidden trigger, no sabotage, just procedure executing as written. While Victor argued, I remained measured. I didn't file a lawsuit. I didn't go public. I submitted a formal retaliation complaint under federal whistleblower protections, citing termination for refusing to violate an approved anti-nepotism policy. It wasn't a weapon. It was documentation. The complaint required the company to preserve records. It required internal review. It created a timeline. Most importantly, it shifted the issue from personality conflict to protected activity. That distinction matters in courtrooms and in boardrooms. By midweek, the insurer followed up again, this time asking whether independent counsel had evaluated potential fiduciary exposure. Translation was the CEO's decision defensible. Victor's tone on subsequent calls changed. Shorter sentences, less volume. Then something unexpected surfaced. During a closed board session, one director asked a quiet question: how many other exceptions had been made for executive family members over the past 5 years? Silence. That question reframed everything. My termination was no longer an isolated incident. It was potentially a pattern. For the first time since 9:03 a.m., Victor wasn't controlling the room. He was answering to it. If you agree that filing a formal whistleblower retaliation complaint instead of reacting emotionally was the right move, leave a 1 in the comments, because speaking up about governance and fairness matters more than most people realize. By the end of the week, the pressure stopped being theoretical and started bending the room. What had begun as a CEO's show of authority was now a board-level fracture. 2 directors formally requested a reconsideration vote regarding my termination and Victor's handling of it. That alone signaled instability. Boards do not revisit executive decisions lightly, especially not ones delivered with public confidence. But this was no longer about personnel. It was about exposure. Victor tried to regain control. He framed it as loyalty. We can't undermine leadership every time someone resists direction, he argued. The phrasing was careful. The subtext was not. He needed the board to treat this as discipline, not governance. Brittany was asked to leave the room. That detail mattered more than anyone said aloud. Without her present, the conversation sharpened. The CFO, who had been cautious all week, finally laid out the numbers plainly. The system I architected and governed processed 74% of the company's revenue flow. Subscription billing, enterprise contracts, data licensing, most of it moved through compliance checkpoints embedded in that platform. If compliance coverage were suspended, even temporarily, the implications would ripple outward. Credit rating agencies could interpret it as internal control instability. A downgrade would increase borrowing costs. It could trigger covenant reviews on existing debt. This wasn't personal. It was arithmetic. Victor's responses grew shorter. He insisted the matter would be resolved quickly, that insurance concerns were exaggerated, but directors began asking procedural questions instead of strategic ones. When governance language replaces growth language, leadership is already weakening. Then the next layer arrived. Late that afternoon, the company received a formal inquiry from one of our primary lending banks. The letter requested clarification regarding recent compliance developments and asked whether any internal control weaknesses had been identified. Banks do not ask questions unless risk models light up. That inquiry changed the atmosphere entirely. The issue had escaped internal containment. It was now external. The fracture wasn't loud. It was structural. And for the first time since this began, Victor wasn't defending a decision. He was defending his seat. The bank's inquiry didn't calm Victor. It ignited him. By the next executive call, his voice carried the edge of someone who realized the narrative was slipping away. She sabotaged us, he said flatly. This is intentional disruption. I listened in through counsel, silent and steady. It was predictable. When governance turns against ego, ego looks for an enemy. IT responded first. Calm. Documented. There's no sabotage. The chief systems architect stated, all restrictions were triggered automatically under existing compliance protocols. Another executive added, nothing has been altered. The system is functioning as designed. That was the part Victor couldn't argue with. There were logs, timestamps, audit trails, every restriction tied directly to a documented governance clause approved by the board years earlier. No hidden code, no backdoors, just policy executing without bias. Still, he pushed harder. She engineered the framework to control the company. General counsel didn't flinch. The framework was ratified by this board. The shift in language was subtle but irreversible. The conversation stopped being about me and started being about procedure. Directors began asking when they were notified, who authorized the termination email, why the charter language regarding custodian removal had been bypassed. It was no longer Reagan versus Victor. It was governance versus unilateral action. One director, who had been quiet until then, leaned forward. We've seen this pattern before. The room stilled. He reminded the board of an incident 4 years earlier, when an executive's son had been quietly granted elevated data access. I had flagged it, halted the authorization, and insisted on independent audit clearance. At the time, Victor had publicly supported the decision, calling it responsible leadership. Now that safeguard was being reframed as sabotage. The director's voice was measured. She prevented us from taking on risk then. Why would she create it now? Silence followed. Victor's counterattack had exposed something he hadn't intended: the consistency of my position. This wasn't retaliation. It was continuity. And for the first time since he raised his voice in that conference room, the board stopped reacting to him. They started evaluating him. By the following Monday, the matter moved behind closed doors. The board convened an executive session without senior management present. No assistants, no observers, just directors, counsel, and the weight of accumulated consequences. I wasn't in the room, but my attorney was. The updates came in controlled fragments. The discussion was no longer about compliance triggers or insurance inquiries. It had narrowed to accountability. Victor defended himself first. I was protecting company culture. He said, we can't allow executives to be undermined by internal resistance. Culture. It's the word leaders use when governance gets inconvenient. General counsel responded without raising her voice. You terminated a registered governance officer without board authorization. That constitutes a potential breach of fiduciary duty. The language changed the temperature of the room. Fiduciary duty is not abstract. It is enforceable. Directors owe it to shareholders. A CEO violating it places every board member at risk. Victor attempted one last pivot. He argued that urgency required decisive action, that internal dynamics had been misinterpreted, but the documentation was clear. No board vote, no recorded authorization, no procedural compliance. The vote was conducted by written ballot. No debate afterward, no speeches. When the count was complete, Victor lost his majority. He wasn't escorted out that afternoon. Corporate exits rarely resemble television. Instead, an announcement was drafted. Effective immediately. Victor Hale would step down pending further review. The fracture had become removal. An hour later, my attorney received a call from the board chair. They wanted me back, not as an employee. They proposed reinstating me with expanded authority, formal elevation of the system custodian role into a board-level governance position, independent from executive control, reporting directly to the audit committee. It wasn't an apology. It was a structural correction. For the first time since 9:03 a.m., the system wasn't reacting. It was being redesigned. And, this time, the design would not rely on anyone's ego. When the board asked me to return, I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity, power. I've learned, is loud when it's insecure and quiet when it's certain. I had no interest in Victor's chair. Titles built on ego collapsed the same way his did. What mattered was structure. During the negotiation call, I was direct. I would return under 3 conditions. First, independent governance oversight. The system custodian role would report directly to the audit committee, not to the CEO. That separation ensured no executive could bypass compliance through pressure or personality again. Second, the anti-nepotism clause would be strengthened. Any executive relative seeking privileged system access would require external audit clearance, documented board acknowledgement, and annual disclosure in governance filings. No informal exceptions. No learning opportunities disguised as authority. Third, the custodian role would be elevated formally to board officer status, embedded into the corporate charter. Removal would require a supermajority vote and written justification recorded in board minutes. There was no argument this time. The board understood what had nearly happened: insurance exposure, credit instability, lender scrutiny, all triggered by one unilateral decision. They agreed. The amendments were drafted within 48 hours. Outside counsel reviewed them. The insurer was notified. The audit firm acknowledged the governance correction. The compliance dashboard shifted from restriction to monitored status. Brittany was reassigned to a marketing analytics division. No executive privileges. No system-level access. The change wasn't punitive, it was procedural. Authority would follow qualification, not bloodline. I returned to the building the following Monday. Not through the employee entrance, but through the executive lobby. The badge they issued carried a different designation: board officer. There were no speeches, no public reconciliation. Later that afternoon, a formal statement was released. Victor Hale had officially resigned. The wording cited leadership transition. Transitions are polite words for consequences. I didn't take his office. I didn't want it. I took something quieter. Control without spectacle. Governance without favoritism. And this time, the system didn't depend on a single decision-maker. It depended on structure. That difference is what keeps companies standing. In the end, the collapse everyone expected never came. There was no system failure, no public scandal, no dramatic shutdown. The platform kept running, clients kept paying, revenue kept flowing. The only thing that failed was impulse masquerading as authority. Victor lost his seat because of his own decision. Not because I retaliated. Not because I sabotaged anything. He stepped outside the structure that protected the company and assumed personality could override policy. It couldn't. There was no revenge. There was governance. There was compliance. There was the charter he ignored. The audit review closed with no material weaknesses. The insurer reinstated full coverage once the governance amendments were filed. The lending bank withdrew its inquiry after the board transition was announced. Credit outlook stabilized. The company survived not because of loyalty, but because the framework held. I didn't celebrate his resignation. I documented it. Justice in corporate life is rarely loud. It's procedural. It moves through minutes, votes, filings, and signatures. It doesn't shout. It records. People asked if I felt vindicated. I felt consistent. I enforced the same policy whether it protected the company from outsiders or from its own leadership. Victor once told me, in a room full of executives, train her or leave. I left. And in the end, he was the one replaced. What stayed with me wasn't the confrontation. It was the realization that structure protects you long before people do. I didn't win because I was louder, smarter, or more strategic. I stood on policy I had helped build and refused to bend it for convenience. That's not dramatic. It's disciplined, in real life. Integrity rarely looks heroic. It looks uncomfortable. It looks like being misunderstood. It sometimes looks like walking out of a room without knowing if you'll walk back in. But if your name is tied to something, your work, your signature, your standards, compromising it to avoid tension always costs more in the long run. So here's the real question: if you were in that chair, with your reputation on one side and pressure on the other, what would you protect, your position or your principles? Some of you listening right now may be dealing with favoritism, quiet rule bending, or pressure to just make it happen. You don't have to be dramatic. You don't have to be aggressive. but you do have to be clear about where your line is. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to know what part of the world this story reached. If this message meant something to you, consider subscribing, commenting, liking, or sharing it. Not for me, for the next person who feels cornered at work and needs to hear that structure matters. One subscription helps this conversation travel further. One share might give someone the courage to document instead of surrender. You're not just supporting a channel, you're reinforcing the idea that doing the right thing still has value, and that matters more than you think. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.